consultant colleagues spoken to Democratic Services who have told off the relevant people who didn't send you the papers. I'm reliably informed it's happening again. If it's happening again, then I will talk to them very politely, okay, which they don't want. Okay, but I'm grateful to our Democratic Services colleagues for doing that. So thank you very much for your indulgence of me with that. I'm very kind. So now we move on to item 6, which is the council housing budget. And again, for people who are here, there are certain rules the council follows, which is that deputies are essentially not allowed to come back because they've already made their presentations. However, I have made notes of various of their questions that they've raised and the issues that they've raised, and so I will be asking it for you, Cal and Mr. Halfpenny. Okay? The rents and the charges. Who wishes to... I'm going to say who wishes to go first. Who is going to go first? Alan, thank you. Mr. Denford, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. So today I'm presenting the Housing Revenue Account Budget Report for 2023-24 financial year. The report seeks the Cabinet members' decision on the setting of rents, service charges and other charges, taking into account the views of tenants. This year's rent consultation started with a line-by-line review of the budget in September 2022. There was then a meeting with the Residents' Consortium in December and an article in House Talk magazine. Both of these set out the draft officer proposals and asked for feedback ahead of today's meeting. The initial comments from tenants were reported back to another meeting of the Residents' Consortium on the 5th of January 2023, and further feedback was encouraged. The responses are set out in Appendix 10 of the report. I will now run through the recommendations of the report and outline where the proposals differ from those in the consultation. Recommendation 1 notes the forecast outturn for 2022-23, the current year. This is a deficit of circa 2.4 million. The reasons for this are set out in paragraph 4.1.3 of the report. Utility costs have more than doubled. The cost of materials for repairs have risen by up to 15%, and the staff pay award exceeded the budget provision. Recommendations 2 and 3 deal with the rent setting. It is proposed to increase the rents by 7% from Monday the 3rd of April 2023, and this is the maximum allowed under a government-imposed rent cap. This increase would see average rents rise from £93.36 per week to £99.57 per week, a rise of £6.21 per week. Paragraph 3.1.5 states that rents will be limited to the published Local Authority Housing Allowance, or LHA, rate. It is worth noting that under previous year's rent standard, a rise of the Consumer Price Index plus 1% would have been allowed. Based on the September 2022 CPI, Consumer Price Index, this rise would have been 11.1%. The result of a lower than inflationary rent increase is a budgeted deficit of 1.3 million in 2023-24, which we funded from a draw on the revenue reserve. The table in paragraph 6.1 illustrates a forecast 5-year draw on reserves of over £6 million, which is unsustainable in the longer term, but officers are committed to continuing their deficit reduction programme, which has been running for over 2 years now. Recommendations 4 to 7 seek approval for increases in the general service charge, sheltered housing service charge, the laundry charges and the heating charges. The proposals continue the policy of full cost recovery so that the residents receiving the services pay for them. The general service charge proposals are in Appendix 5. The lower rate for houses and bungalows will increase from £6.72 per week to £7.14 per week. The higher rate for flats and masonettes will increase from £16.80 per week to £18.20 per week. This rise is 14p per week lower than the figure in the consultation following a reassessment of the cost of communal lighting. The proposed sheltered housing charges are in Appendix 6. The charges and the respective increases are dependent on the level of service. The charge for Category 1 increases by £1.26 per week, Category 2 by £5.60 per week, and Category 2.5 by £11.34 per week. The proposed laundry charges are in Appendix 7. There is an increase for the first time in 5 years due to energy cost inflation. Washing tokens are proposed to go up by £1 and drying tokens by 50p. Moving on to the proposed heating charges for the 15 blocks that receive landlord heating. Despite the best efforts of the building services team to reduce energy consumption and negotiate the best tariffs, substantial increases are necessary next year. However, the team have taken advantage of an improvement in energy prices in January to secure 50% of next year's supply ahead of time. This has meant that the proposals in Appendix 8 are lower than in the consultation. The report sets out the revised charges for a tenant currently paying £10 per week. In Edgbaston and Tipton, the charge would be £19.70, down from £21.20 in the consultation. In the sheltered blocks, the charge would be £16.70, down from £20.50, and in the Dickens blocks, the charge would be £20, down from £29.30. Recognising that these are still daunting increases, the residents' consultation included information on the energy advice and support available. So moving on to Recommendation 8, which talked about garage and parking sites. Proposals for these rents are set out in Appendix 9. An increase of 10.1% in line with the September 22 Consumer Price Index is proposed for all sites. The policy of charging more for non-locals is retained. Recommendations 9 and 10 give authority for managers to incur expenditure and to the Director of Housing, Neighbourhood and Building Services to amend the final budget for 23-24 if circumstances change. The final recommendation notes that the forecast revenue budgets up to the year 2026-27, as referred to earlier, as set out in Appendix 3. I would now be happy to take any questions on the report's content.
Okay, thank you, Alan. As I said, the rules of the council are that deputies can't say anything else, so terribly sorry. So I'm going to try and deal with some of the issues that Cal and Mr Halfpenny, on behalf of his mum, raised earlier. The first, and also Mr Gaudier as well, the first issue seemed to be a sense from what Cal read out and from what Paul Gaudier said that the support was going to run out, that there wasn't going to be any help from government in the 23-24 financial year, which is perfectly understandable. Is there any? This is a question to which I know the answer, but I would like an officer to sort of give me an idea of the sort of support that's available from, may or may not be available from government.
Yes, so Darren, Councillor Sanders, I can explain that the energy price cap guarantee will be increasing from £2,500 per year to £3,000 from the 1st of April. The energy rebate, Mr Gaudier mentioned, is coming to an end at the end of March. But from the 1st of April, there will be a number of initiatives that the government will be introducing. And these include a cost of living payment. So these are three £300 cost of living payments, which are means-tested benefits, which will be paid in the spring of 23, autumn of 23, and the spring of 2024. Although the actual dates are to be advised. There's a one-off pensioner payment, so that's for pensioners in the UK claiming pension credit. Disability payment, so there's an automatic one-off payment of £150 for households in the UK claiming disability benefit.
How much is the pensioner payment you've just mentioned?
£300.
Okay.
There's a warm home discount scheme, so one-off discount on electricity bills over the winter, directly applied to bills. Cold weather payments and also winter fuel payments, and so these are all payments for residents that are eligible through various benefits, etc. There'll be no need for residents to apply for them. These will be automatically applied then to the benefits that they receive. In terms of the prepayment voucher, prepayment vouchers, these are issued automatically, but there is a need to have these manually redeemed, and certainly before they expire. So, you know, one of the things we are promoting heavily through our housing officers, but also through the Switched on Portsmouth website, is making sure that residents are aware of what they can claim for in terms of the vouchers, etc., that they'll come through, but also to make sure that they redeem those and get them taken off their bills.
Okay, thank you. Daniel, you may correct me if I'm wrong, so please do, because these are also other government measures that are in place. Benefits are going up by September CPI, which is 10.1%, I understand. Am I wrong? The answer, I believe, is no, but I just wanted to check. So that's the first thing. The national, others call it the national living wage, others will call it the minimum wage, is going up by 9.42%, which is 92p an hour, I believe, as well, from the autumn statement, from April 2023. And so pensions and benefits are going that up. That's before we get to child benefit and other universal credit payments and things like that. And also the benefits cap is increasing by 10.1% for the first time in years, which is also in there in the mix in terms of how people are living. The council also is distributing a household support fund, which includes £120, currently £120 for those missing out on government support, £70 for children of parents eligible for free prescriptions or healthy start vouchers, £150 for disabled people struggling with their heating, and help with basics like food, living costs, energy, the sort of white goods that were mentioned earlier in the deputations as well. So that is also around. And I and the rest of the Cabinet agreed to continue that beyond April this year, and we believe we will get the same amount of money we got from last year, which is about £4 million. So, in other words, there is additional support in the sense that came through, particularly from Paul, that money's running out and I can't live with it isn't there. I think that was the first set of points I picked up from the deputies. The second one, if I'm misquoting you, Mr. Halfpenny, I apologise, okay, was a sense of the system either wasn't built this way, or it's giving money to the grid, or it's not really working, or, it's not flexible enough, and it should be a bit more flexible. I hope I've got that vaguely right, Mr. Halfpenny. You cannot. I got it wrong, did I?
Yes, that wasn't the case. I just didn't understand why the heating system that was installed by Vital Energy and other contractors, I was under the assumption that it generated a certain amount of surplus energy and you sold that back to the energy grid.
Thank you, that was a point I missed out, and I apologise, Mr. Halfpenny. I'm grateful to you for your clarifications. So, energy colleagues.
I can answer that.
I'll have anyone answering, I don't mind.
So the calculation we work out the amount of energy that the energy centre consumes, the amount of gas, and we take off then any income that we generate through electricity, through the CHP, etc. And so we net off the figure, and then the amount that net figure is what's divided by the residents on the Charles Dickens district heating. So everybody pays a proportionate share.
Okay, so in other words, he's right. And then that comes off the bill.
And we do that, yes.
And the charge is basically the rest.
Yeah.
Have I got that 100% right?
That's correct.
I don't want to get it wrong because we've got residents here important.
And the gentleman also asked about the PV on the roof as well,
yes,
of the two blocks. So the PV that's generated there's a fit income which comes into the HRA, and there is also then the energy that the PV generates is used within the communal areas of the block. So that helps to reduce the service charge for lighting and power within the blocks.
There was also a sense of concern around the system's on all the time. I don't need to switch my heating on because next door's got it on 24/7, which is something I know from communal heating blocks as well. What sort of level of flexibility exists in terms of the system itself?
Yeah, the system is an on-demand heating and hot water system, so the system runs 24/7, 365 days a year, so that residents have access to heating and hot water at all times. There are controls within people's properties where they can turn down radiators, etc., thermostatic radiator valves. But the flexibility of the system is a system which was built in the early 2000s, so we're using technology from the 1990s. And the building services team have been working certainly since the middle part of last year in terms of how we can upgrade the system to make the system perhaps more flexible and more controllable by residents moving forward.
And what does that mean?
So then we can utilise things like heat meters, making sure that as we upgrade the systems, that residents, in the future, will only pay for the energy and hot water and heating that they use going forward. But there's a bit of work that needs to be done to bring that to full fruition.
And although we've had people from one group who've been affected by the proposed heating charge rises, we've also got sheltered housing accommodation who aren't here, who are affected. We've got people in 2 blocks in South Somerstown who ain't here, who are affected. Are they going to be subject? Will they be able to receive that help as well?
Yeah, there's ongoing work where we're looking to make the systems more efficient, to improve insulation, to make sure that the systems are optimised in terms of their running times, etc., the flow and return temperatures, etc. And certainly a desire is we're conducting a feasibility study, and we'll engage with the residents in the 2 blocks that you've mentioned in Tipton and Edgbaston in terms of how we can reduce then their reliability on a communal heating system, and perhaps look to enable them to have their own control over the heating systems going forward.
Yeah, I remember trying to tell my mum to turn the heating down, and she wouldn't. Yeah. And that was always tough.
And that piece of work we'll be engaging with residents over the summer, to consult with them and to show them, the pros and cons of the schemes that would be available.
Okay, I want to come to Cal's 3 suggestions in a bit, but he mentioned a figure for gas, which is about £902.70, I think it was, a year. In the Dickens blocks, where I think he's focusing most of his efforts, bless him, is it just paying for gas? Is it paying for anything else?
No. The costs that are in the heating charge is purely for the gas.
Purely for the gas.
But it includes service charges, etc. So it's
not quite. When I say you're saying it's not quite a like-for-like comparison.
Yeah, that's right. The charge that we pay is an all-inclusive cost. The tariffs that were mentioned, I think, are exclusive of things like the standing charge and the VAT.
Okay. My next question is the report we've got. Mention was made of the House Talk article, and for a 1-bedroom flat in the Dickens blocks, the bill in the report is roughly £500 a year less than it was in the House Talk article. How did that happen?
Okay, so we continually work with our energy brokers who are buying our energy on the open energy markets, etc. And so when we published the House Talk article back before Christmas, the figures that we used were the long-term forecast figures that we were being advised by our brokers, etc. Since that time, I think Councillor Corkery mentioned that wholesale energy prices have come down. So we've taken the opportunity, working with our brokers, to forward purchase 50% of our gas and electricity for next year. So we've got that cost certainty. But we've also put in place energy caps, so that if there is a downswing in the market and energy costs start to rise, there is a particular point, and it'll be the point that we've bought the gas already, where if prices start to rise, we'll buy out the rest of our gas and electricity. But we continue to work closely with the brokers, and we'll be buying gas and electricity over the next year in tranches, when we decide it's the right time and the most economic time to buy that.
Because this was a question posed to British Gas this morning, who are making obscene profits as a result of all this. How flexible can you be? And are you saying to us that actually you have had that level of flexibility that British Gas seems to refuse to want to do?
Yes.
And there is potential for further flexibility as well later on in the year. Am I correct?
And that's correct. And I'd also add that the tariff rates that we've put in to the report, so we've bought 50% at, are significantly cheaper than the tariff rates that are published for the energy cap, which is in place at the moment, and also the significant increase in the energy cap, which will be effective from the 1st of April.
And are any of our council tenants really just subject to the energy price guarantee?
Sorry, can you say the question again?
Are any of our council tenants in that, because we've had some heartrending stories this morning from people saying, look, I can't afford this and everything else, with the figures that are in, which are a one-bedroom flat at the moment, about £1,000 a year that they will pay. Are there any tenants who'd be subject purely to the limit of the energy price guarantee, which is £3,000 from April?
3,000. No. No, we've worked out based on average consumption. We
No,
know,
I'm not talking about the communal heating charges. I'm talking about any other tenants who are outside of our communal heating system.
No, residents outside of the communal heating charges would be.
They just pay the market rate. Is that correct?
They'd be applicable to the vacancy.
So they would be subject purely to the £3,000 limit, and
The
that
energy
would be
cap,
the only
yeah.
barrier. Is that right,
That's
Gareth,
correct.
from our heating energy team? You're nodding your head. Okay, I'll take that as yes. Okay, those are all my questions. I hope I've gone through some of the. I know. Hey. All right, because it's you.
Just in terms of the figure I quoted, that was inclusive of standing charges, not of VAT, but even if you add on VAT, that still leaves a differential.
It's still about 950 quid, isn't it?
Yeah, which leaves a differential of £352 a year
Right.
between what someone would be paying if they had a gas meter versus what they will be paying.
Thank you
in a two-bed
for
flat.
that. I now want to
Second
come
thoughts.
to two of your 3 points, which I think are the ones that we can affect, because the third one I think we've already covered. With regards to the Cal's proposals with regards to freezing rents, Cal said that it would be a £5.687 million loss. Alan, do we get that money back? Ever?
Thank you, Chair. No, we don't. Under the current rent guidance, there was an exception this year where a 7% cap was put on. Going forward, the rent standard says that we are limited to CPI plus 1%. So any reduction in the base level of rents in the current year, we couldn't recover that money in a future year without going above that CPI plus 1% increase that we've factored into all the figures in the report.
Okay, so in other words, basically it's a 6 million, crudified, it's a £6 million loss every year. Yeah?
Yes, and going up marginally because of inflation.
Okay, all right, that's fine. With regards to the heating charge, now I'm going to take, so Cal's written to me, so I'm going to take what he's said as no rise is above 50%, because although for the Dickens blocks they're looking at a doubling, was a tripling, it's now doubling because of the work we've done. That's double. There are other blocks where the charges have risen by significantly less, or proposed to rise by significantly less than 100%. So I'm taking what Cal says as a cap of 50% increases that essentially is paid back in subsequent years. So not a halving everywhere, but a 50% cap. Is that doable?
Okay, if I could just sort of illustrate that with reference to paragraph 4.14 in the report, where I've talked about this hypothetical tenant that currently pays £10 per week. And I've used that figure deliberately to be very transparent in the size of the increase. So I think the proposal from Councillor Corkery is that somebody paying £10 per week would be paying no more than £15 a week going forward. That would reduce the income for our heating account by £250,000 in the next year. So we would, all other things being equal, end up the year with a deficit on that account. Because we have a reserve, we would be able to recover that over a number of future years. But that would mean that it would be, because tenants come and go, there will be different tenants paying for the benefit to tenants next year. So, yes, I think it's doable. Whether it's equitable, I think, is a slightly different question.
Okay, so what you're saying is effectively people in the blocks affected, which are the 15 blocks affected, including sheltered housing, would be paying, if they moved in, they would be paying different rates to the people who are living there. Is that right?
No, everyone would pay the same, depending on their type of property. but they would be paying more than they would otherwise have done because of the decision we would be taking for next year and trying to recover it over a period of years.
Okay, so in other words, it's the clawing the money back that leads to the inequity. So in other words, you have an equitable system in this financial year that would lead to £250,000, not a £6 million deficit, but a £250,000 deficit. But unlike with the proposed rent freeze, there would be a way of getting the money back. Correct?
That's correct, but obviously the policy has always been that that we recover the cost through the tenants that are receiving the service. So that would be moving slightly away from that policy.
Okay. But that would be with a capped heating charge increase of 50%. Have I got that right?
That's correct,
Guys.
Yes.
So not a halving for everyone, but a cap of 50%, 50%. Yes?
Yes, that's how I've calculated that figure.
Because that's how I understand what Cal is putting forward here.
That was my understanding, yes.
Right. Does any other officer wish to comment before I go to our spokespeople? James?
I think I just want to clarify then, because my understanding is we're still seeking to recover the charge. In very practical terms, we're doing so over a longer period of time, in
Correct.
essence. And we're using the reserve to hold that figure until we can recover it over future years. So for a resident, they won't feel the full increase in the next financial year, but we'll need to be very clear with them that there'll be further charges or recovery over years 2 and 3, depending on how we go with that. It's doable. It's a change to the proposal, but there are delegations in the report which will allow us to make those amendments as part of your decision.
And also, from what Meredith and Gareth were saying earlier on, there's also a facility to look at whether we actually just buy cheaper anyway in year, and that exists within the delegations in the report. So it may be that although there's money coming back, although there's money up, or we have to, under Cal's proposal, if we're putting forward money up front and having to sub it basically up front, there's a real chance that we could actually, the price will go down, so the overall cost of recovery in future years may go down, he said, hopefully. Okay. Deputies, that was all my questions. I hope I've covered the issues you were talking about reasonably well. George. Oh, I knew it was going to happen. It took an hour and a half. I want to come back to that in my summing up, if that's okay, Cal. But I mentioned questions about what support was available, which I think is related to those two things. George.
Thanks.
Oh, sorry, no, not you. Residents Consortium. I do apologise. It's using a toilet in the middle of a meeting. I tell you, it's terrible. Residents, any thoughts that you may have? Honesty, please.
I think most of us realise that things have got to go up. We're just hoping and praying that they won't go up too much.
Sue.
Sorry, it's going to have to happen, isn't it? As horrible as it is, it's just something that we're going to have to suck up, I suppose. Do the best we can.
Okay. Hello, my friend.
I don't think it's been mentioned this morning, but about 3 to 4 weeks ago, there was a local radio report that government had cut funding to this PCC by 22 million. And that all department heads will have to go to rejig their budgets. Does this take into account what we're talking about now, any reduced funding you might get? Because at the last residents' meeting, the report on that we were going to get £22 million less wasn't out at that time.
Okay. Mr. Denford, I'm going to try and give a lesson in local government finance, so I'm going to get this wrong, okay? The council operates within two separate budgets.
Yeah.
One of the budgets is decided by all 42 councillors, and that will be decided on the 28th of February. That's called the General Fund. As far as housing is concerned, that covers things like homelessness, regulating private sector landlords, so the pitch fees, all that stuff we talked about earlier. That's one budget. It is right that the settlement that was announced in the autumn statement is what they call flat, which means it will be below inflation. That's the first thing. That's part of the government's plan to stabilise the mess. The second bit is this budget. This budget is not that. It is completely separate. The vast majority, I think it's 3/4, Mr. Denford, of the money that comes spent on doing up people's homes, making blocks safe through having wardens, running adventure playgrounds, all that sort of stuff, comes from your rent. The charge element is relatively small. The vast majority of it comes from the rent. Costs have gone up significantly in these meetings. Mairead has talked about 20-25% increases in costs. I've seen other projects that have gone up by 50%, which is just the cost of the things I may mention a bit later. So there are shortfalls knocking around. We certainly, as a council in the main budget, didn't have to have any savings, didn't have to make any savings, provided we put the council tax up by 3% when we started this financial year. But a combination of things that we all know about has meant that we have had to make savings. Okay. So yes, sorry, I hope I've got that vaguely right, Mr. Denford. Otherwise, I'm going to be in trouble.
I can't fault you, Chair.
Oh, I'm so glad that worked in rehearsals. I tell you, I was not aware of any. Okay, sorry, George.
That's all right, mate. Third time lucky. Obviously, we keep hearing about small increases, 1% here, 2% here, £3 here, £4 here. The problem is when you accumulate all them together across fuel and food and everything else, it actually turns into a lot of money. And even today, I think I've had 3 or 4 times because, it's only a small amount. But as I say, it all adds up. Now, I do understand, as you say, I understand business, and I'm one of those rare people that have the experience of both sides of the coin. I mean, not that I'm going to gauge into details, but a few people here know that I was homeless 12 years ago and, used to literally live on the streets, and then I got lucky in the music industry, made some money and done all right for myself. And now, obviously, I'm a large portfolio landlord. But I actually agree with Cal that freezing the rents would be a really good thing for a year. I mean, in my personal properties, 10 of my flats in Newcastle, for example, they're all social housing tenants. I haven't increased the rents for 3 years since COVID. And what I've noticed in those properties is that the money that they're saving, they've actually used to improve the properties themselves and do work themselves because they've got more funds available. Same as a property owned in Tennyson Road in Portsmouth. Once again, not increased the rent at all, although my mortgage rates have gone up, not increased the rent at all for 3 years. I went and inspected it actually at the weekend, and it's in a better condition now than when I give it to the tenant. But that's because he's paying $450 below market rent, and he's a single father with kids, and he said to me, I did the garden, I did this and did that. He didn't ask me for a penny to do it. So sometimes it's a kind of a bit like trickle-down economics in a sense of like, you give them the tax saving or the housing saving in this instance, and they invest it into their home because it is their home, and they're proud of it, and people will invest in it. Now, on the flip side of that, from a business aspect, I completely respect, it's the same issue we have with the council tax, isn't it, in the relation that if you stop it for 1 year, you can never recover it. It's not, and I think this is where the issue we've got here is if we don't put the 7% increase on, we can never get it back. And it's all well and good saying, well, we've got a £20 million revenue, hold or whatever you want to call it. But how quickly will that dissipate and disappear if we don't increase this 7% because we can never get it back? However, why don't we flip this around, and in relation to Cal's hardship fund, why didn't you increase it by 7%, approve the increase by 7%, but at the same time put £5 million in a hardship fund, right? Because then you're not going to lose it for future years. You can give tenants a year's notice and say, right, what we've done is we've popped £5 million in a hardship fund. This can be solely ring-fenced and used for rent increases, subject to the fact that you can prove that you can't afford to pay them. Then you're not losing the increase for years to come. Your budget deficit will never go down over years and years and years. We've got a £20 million bank account sitting with money, so that goes down to £15 million. I think we can suffice that. Tenants then are secure for a year, and they've got a year to sort it out. And the caveat being is that they can only claim it or only use it if they can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they require it. This would then satisfy the Conservative trickle-down economics plan. It would resolve the social plans of the Labour Party. It would keep our residents happy, whilst the council aren't suffering for years to come.
Sorry.
And in my opinion, that would put a sticking plaster over what is going to be an incredibly hard year. That's a suggestion, and I think it could be doable, and it's reasonable. I know people will probably have to go away and talk about it before making any decisions, but it's an idea that it resolves the business aspect, because we won't lose money in years to come. It resolves all the problems in relation to the hardship fund, and only people that can't afford to do it can use that hardship fund. So you might not even spend £5 million. You just ring fence it.
Okay, so I'm George's suggestion. Again, is that doable, or is there a cost? Because we say effectively £5 million is set aside for helping people, which is about 5% of the whole budget, because it's a £99.4 million budget. What impact would that have on anything else? Does that mean there's £5 million less to spend on things like repairs and wardens and stuff like that? Is that the outcome? What's the professional advice? Is that the outcome?
So,
James?
Yes, that is the outcome. In essence, I think, so, the proposal is saying that we require the rent increase in order to sustain the services we're currently delivering. And even with that rent increase, we start next year with a 1.3 million deficit. So we've got some work to do to close that gap. If you use a portion of that rent increase and put it, as described, into a hardship fund, it leaves a 5 million hole, which we need to try and resolve. So it just increases the deficit position. And as Alan outlined earlier, there's then a consequence on the overall financial position for the HRA going into future years. So it's doable, but the choices you're then faced with is how do we create £5 million worth of savings in order to hold a hardship fund to redistribute to residents, because it's all rents. And at the minute, the rents are being paid for services that everyone is receiving.
Okay. So, as you say, the answer to my question is yes, essentially.
Can I come back on that?
Yeah. Once.
Good. So if I have £1 million in my bank account and my revenue is, £1,000 a month and my outgoings are £1,000 a month, I've got no net loss or no net gain. I've still got that £1 million in the bank account. If I spend 500,000 of that in the bank account, and I've still got £1,000 outgoings and £1,000 incoming, I'm still not on a net gain or a net loss, but my bank account is just slightly lower. You don't have to sacrifice any services. You don't have to sacrifice any ability to improve residents' thing, because what you're using is a reserve fund. And I completely agree with Councillor Corkery. If the reserve fund isn't being used for emergency situations or problems like this, then what is it there for? So I do respect that there'd be a £5 million deficit, but it's a £5 million deficit from a £20 million of reserve funds. It's not. We're not going out to get a loan. We're not going out to get a new debt or anything like that. We're not. Nothing like that will be affected. We don't have to impact residents' living standards or their fixing standards. We don't have to. This is money that is held in a. I'd completely understand if we had 0 pennies in the bank account. Completely get it. But we haven't. We've got 20 million, and if we're not going to use it now to help residents when they're most in need, when the cost of living is going up, what's the point in having it? Honestly, what's the point in having it? And it won't affect people's day-to-day.
Again, thank you for that. If I may, I'll come back to that, but I would say as part of the proposals that 2.3 million quid is being taken from the reserves to fund the in-year deficit this year. So reserves are used. I'll come back to your suggestion in a bit. Daniel. You've been writing away merrily, I see, which is good news.
I wouldn't go that far. I've just got a couple of questions. So, obviously, any decision you take is from the numbers you've been given by the officers. So, one is to James directly: is what effect does either proposal have on getting government funding for other projects? Because I assume if I'm a government civil servant and I see lots of red icons across the sheets, does that affect any way of getting funding for different areas of the council in any way? I just, obviously I have no experience in doing it, so I just wanted to know. And then the second is, Merid, is about communications and comms to residents regarding different things that they can apply for. So one of them is pension credit. I know a lot of pensioners actually aren't aware that they're entitled to this this amount of money, and I know that once you get pension credit, most of the increases, like I think there was a Christmas bonus, for want of a better word, that was paid automatically. But I think a lot of pensioners, given the cost of living crisis, may not necessarily know that they may be entitled to this fund. So I just wanted to know about the comms from the council on this side. And then I think the final point from what George was making is, I totally agree in some aspects, maybe not the large amount of numbers, but if we've got some reserves in the council, we could possibly, this is just mainly for your perspective, Darren, is the optics as a council. If you can just lower it from 7 and say, oh, we're going to raise it by 7, let's do 5% instead, that any kind of decrease would probably help a lot of residents. But I think those are my main questions, and any experience or help would be greatly appreciated.
Okay, officers?
I'll take the first question, which was to do with the impact on the ability to attract government funding. I'm not aware of any negative impact in our ability to attract government funding. And I guess it's implicit, or at least I hope it's implicit in here, that the position we're presenting to you, we will continue to do all we can as an officer group working with Cabinet and colleagues to improve this position throughout the next financial year through a variety of ways in which we intend to tackle the deficit and look for any funding opportunities that are available to us to support the housing service.
Yeah. And Daniel's second question?
I can pick that one up.
If you could.
Councillor Sanders, yes. So in terms of highlighting what people can apply for, so within the housing building and neighbourhood service, we've got money advisors, housing officers that work very closely with residents. Also, we've got the Switched On Portsmouth offer, Councillor Weems, in terms of it's got a very high profile on social media, etc., but also in the written format in terms of posters in blocks, etc. We've also then done a lot of training for our frontline staff, so both housing officers, but also then surveyors in my own team, so they go into properties and they can refer people into LEAP, which is almost like a gateway then into where people then can get help, perhaps for income maximisation, for help around energy, access to things like free white goods, etc. So there's a variety of areas where people can find advice, and we continue to strive to make sure that we reach out to as many people in as many different formats as well to do that.
Okay, thank you. Daniel, do you have anything else at all?
No, it's mainly a comment. Obviously, I don't know what the Chancellor and what the Prime Minister are up to, but I'm hoping possibly in the spring statement there might be some good news. But, there isn't much of it at the moment, but hopefully there's some in March.
Yes, all I heard, Daniel, was no significant tax cuts. I think that's what some members of your party are after, I think. So there we go. Okay, thank you very much, colleagues, for this discussion. I've wanted to take it on for a long while because, frankly, this is the most important decisions that we take. And unlike the main budget, where it's the 42 of us, it's one person and it's me. So that's why it's useful, but it is now my turn. I have to say, to start with, colleagues, this is not a place I wanted to be in. You may have noticed I'm acutely aware that we're in a cost of living crisis. Indeed, last year I increased rents by less than I could because we had to do something to help our tenants and leaseholders. We still ended the year in a surplus despite that. Indeed, some of our Conservative colleagues said don't do it because they wanted to maximise the surplus, but I thought it was the right thing to do. And as I told the Residents' Consortium, my starting point was to do it again this year. And indeed, for much of the year, it looked as if that would happen. As a result of the efforts last year, the team has embarked on a significant programme to cut waste, backed by our drive as Liberal Democrats to build and buy council homes, and various things made sure that we are actually, for much of the year, looking at a £2 million surplus in the account, which is great news. Absolutely wonderful. However, the expansion of Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine, I can't say it's the start of a war because it started in 2014, and unfortunately the Tory government tanking the economy have destroyed all that. The increased energy and construction costs those two endeavours have created turned a £2 million surplus into a £2.3 million loss. And that is not a great position for anyone. And that brings us to today. We're not alone. Labour Exeter, Labour Barking, Dagenham, Labour Sunderland, Conservative Derby, all are in the same boat, and all have raised rents by 7%. Every council is facing a dilemma we've spent the past 2.5 hours trying to get through, which is trying to balance huge increases in costs of construction and of energy with not punishing tenants. As you know, I take all offers of help very seriously, as you may have seen in this meeting. And if anyone from any party or group has any bright ideas, I tend to take them on board and consider them. I know some politicians don't like that because it steals their thunder. I'm not one of them. I'm keen on putting our city, not political party, first. And that's why I went to the Residents' Consortium in early January to hear their views on what to do. I was the only councillor to do so, which was intriguing. I refuse to doubt the sincerity of anyone, Maria. But I think what I was told was basically I wouldn't do your job, which was not the most encouraging response I've ever had, I have to say, on that. I hope that our briefing meeting will come up with something. However, I was the only councillor there. Cal very kindly, Cal was in an even worse position than he was now, said something had turned up. So I was the only councillor there. And I note that no councillors asked, as they can, for an office briefing to discuss the plans, which they can do. So I assume that there were no alternatives. I was clearly wrong with George's today. And so it's in that spirit that I turn to the proposals that have been put forward, and I start with what Cal wanted to say. And before I do, I just wanted to say this. I think, Cal, the way you've been treated by Labour's cancel culture is a disgrace, I have to say. You won't want me saying it, but it's true. And you know that I said that when I called you straight after the briefing meeting to ask for a chat. If we want to get rid of local councils, it should be local people who do it, is my view. But I wanted to get that out before we start. You said you may not want to hear it from me or anyone like me, but it doesn't make it any less true. But instead of that chat, Cal sent me and his social media a letter. And so I have asked officers to look at the suggestions, and some of that has actually played out in this meeting. Not least because with things like rent freezes, as you know, that was my starting point anyway. So I shall start with that rent freeze paid from reserves, which was said was my starting point. But I was put off by the damage it would do to the budget in future years, and we've already discussed those figures. If we could get the money back, it would be lovely, but we can't get the money back. And that on top of reserves being raided anyway to deal with this in-year financial deficit is going to be difficult going forwards. And it will mean there'll be really tough decisions about what to do. I mean, do we stop wardens making our blocks safer? Do we stop a playing youth service that brightens the lives of so many people? Do we stop paying the real living wage to staff and contractors? What repairs and estate improvements do we stop then, if we do that? The figures are very clear. If we carry on with what Cal has suggested, we will reach an unsustainable level of reserves in 2 years, 26 months. We will run out of cash in 3 years. And that is an incredible position I do not want to put ordinary working people in, when, as we've heard from the discussion today, unlike last year, benefits and their cap are going up by more than 10%, the minimum wage is going up by more than 9%, and there's between £900 and £1,350 worth of government help for the most vulnerable, as well as the help that we are giving through the Household Support Fund, and that's a radically different proposal. Given that, the rent proposals are the only course we have. But again, as no one has said today, no rent will be more than the local housing allowance. And that's been frozen for 3 years. That reduces our income, but in a cost of living crisis, it is the right thing to do. I now turn to the hardship fund. It is an idea that Cal has regularly mentioned at these meetings, and I'm grateful to him for it. And it is a nice idea in these circumstances, but one already exists. It's called the Hardship Support Fund, which I mentioned earlier on. And that's nearly £4 million of support for the most vulnerable in our city, many of whom live in council blocks. And that's already there. Sure, I want people to be encouraged to actually apply for it more. But when you're faced with things like £120 for those missing out on government support, £70 for children of parents eligible for free prescriptions or Healthy Start vouchers, or £150 for disabled people struggling with their heating, there is support there. I understand the hardship fund, although the £5 million I think would just blow a complete hole in our repairs budget. So I disagree with the amount, George. But the principle, I think, is a sensible one, and it's already there, and it's already £4 million worth. So with the hardship fund, on top of all the money advisors and support and offer from the council and the increases in benefits and their cap, I think that we should point people to the hardship support fund rather than have a hardship fund of our own. As far as the heating charges are concerned, I wanted to do one thing at 10:30 this morning, and because of what has been told, I now want to do another. It is incredibly difficult, and we have to have a balance, because we've heard lots of heart-rending stories this morning from people whose communal heating charges are going up, but there are people, including in blocks who live bang opposite them, who are facing an even worse time. They're facing just having the energy price guarantee of £3,000 as a fig leaf and hoping. And that's not right. So I have to take a more balanced view. And that's why, when I heard energy prices were coming down, I asked officers to see if they could get something cheaper. And they did, cutting the projected rise for, say, a one-bedroom flat in Copperfield House by nearly £500 a year, something we can't do for blocks like Peggotty House, which aren't in the communal heating scheme. I'm pleased that they will be kept under review, and if we can find lower prices, there are delegations that exist, and I would like it to come back to a public meeting. However, given what Mr. Denford has said, I do want to vary the heating charge proposal. So instead of it being in accordance with Appendix 7, I think it is, my tablet isn't quite working, I just blame IT, which is that we take on board, we cap the 23-24 heating rise charge at 50% with money to be recovered in future years. Okay? You got that? Democratic Services people. So that's a variant. I'll write it out later. Because if it's doable, I'm interested in all bright ideas. And I'm grateful to Cal for coming up with that idea, because I think that will help. It will mean a halving for the Dickens blocks, but it will mean lower reductions in the increase in our sheltered housing blocks and in Edgbaston and Tipton as well. It will still happen. There will still be problems. People will still go under. I don't want to do this at all, but I think that's a sensible proposal from Cal, and I'm happy to take it on. We can't stop here. We are still left with a £1.3 million deficit in the 23-24 financial year. That's not on. And that's why officers are going ahead with a plan to rectify that deficit, which I have asked for. I also want the HRA to be stable in the long term too. That affects a lot of what we do. There was some discussion around the state of blocks earlier on. And that's absolutely right, around the age of blocks as well, and that's why officers, at my insistence, are producing an asset management strategy now, so that we can tackle the cost of that early, rather than as normally happens in local government and national government, just waiting for a crisis to turn up and panic. So that's also a proposal. So these decisions are not what I wanted. They're not what anyone wanted. And you've heard the heart-rending stories this morning, which explains why. I don't have to. But an illegal war and a government tanking the economy so much that Britain has a moron premium in world markets have ruined those plans, and other ways to help people through tough times, I'm sorry. And so it's with reluctance that I'm forced to approve the rent rises, the service charge rises, and the heating charge rises as amended. So there is a cap of 50% with the money to come back in future years, with a view of seeing whatever lower prices we can get later on down the line. With that change, I'm proposing to approve the other recommendations, colleagues. And I don't want to do it, but I feel we have no choice. So, on that rather sombre note, and I apologise for that, I believe there's nothing else on the agenda. So with that, I'm proposing to close the meeting at 12:28. Thank you all for your patience and your time with me, and have a peaceful day.